Teatro Morlacchi for our event with our very special guest, John Sweeney, and of course our beloved Eric Friesen. And just before we start, I'd like to tell you, give you a little background about why John is sitting here today. With this terrible war having started in Ukraine in February, it was still at a time when I was thinking, who can I get for a special guest this year? A few leads hadn't worked out. And I was following John on Twitter. I saw this man with his orange hat, giving a diary every day on Twitter from the war zone. And he was so intriguing and also so very human and wonderful reporting. And so I thought, well, that's the topic of the moment. It's the topic of the moment. So I went to his website and I found a contact form and I wrote a little message. And no, I must say that in a tweet, he mentioned something about Perugia, like he knew all the bars here. And I thought, Perugia, that's funny, So I wrote this message and I said, I've got this music festival in Perugia and the program's set, but I have an opening on July the 6th at 4 p.m. And, I don't think this will work in a million years, but if you wanted to come, we'd be so thrilled. 3 minutes later, I get an email. It says, I'll be there. That's what it was. I'll be there. I thought, wow. That's the kind of person I like, one who answers right away. So here we are, and we're absolutely thrilled to bits.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll give you a quick summary of this man's background, and then we'll start the conversation. I should just say we'll do this for about 45 minutes or so, and then, of course, we'll take your questions. So I guess we're going to shout them out, or I'll go down and do the Vanna White thing or something. We'll see. But anyway, John Sweeney worked on the newspaper The Observer for 12 years, covering wars and revolutions in over 60 countries, too many to name. Then for the BBC from 2001 to 2019, much of it working for the famous Panorama program and also for BBC Newsnight. He's written 8 non-fiction books, and he has 2 coming out very soon, and 4 books of fiction, including his bestseller called Elephant Moon from 2016 about the Second World War in Burma. Since then, he's been a free spirit. That's since leaving the BBC in 2019, he's been a free spirit, reporting, as Angela said, on Twitter. His Twitter handle is John Sweeney Roar, R-O-A-R. And with at least now 240,000, or is it more, 245,000 followers by the last count. And he continues to write books, he makes podcasts, and he's interviewed on a lot of other media. Just a few of his greatest achievements. He's taken on the Church of Scientology. He's gone underground in North Korea, taken on the activist Tommy Robinson, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Ghislaine Maxwell, just to name a few, and now the war in Ukraine, which he calls Putin's war. And he has a special fondness for Umbria and Perugia in particular. So, John Sweeney, welcome to Trasimeno. Thank you very much. Well, we're going to talk about Ukraine for sure, because that's the topic of the moment, but I can't help but ask you about what happened last night in London. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Health Minister both resigned. Is this the end of Boris Johnson?
Well, so the gossip in Kyiv, and by the way, this is the biggest single room I think I've ever been in my entire life. And I was expecting like 6 people, so I'm personally grateful for every single person who's come. So, the gossip is, why should people going to Kyiv? And the gossip in the Buena Vista, which is the bar in Kyiv where all the journalists hang out, is that Boris Johnson has a Ukrainian mistress. Don't tell anyone. But it feels like it's true. He is way more popular in Ukraine than he is in the United Kingdom. So he's got the first 2 letters of the country, right, book, but not the rest of it. But I know Boris Johnson because I used to work on The Observer, and he used to, and I was a foreign correspondent, and then I'd come back to London, sometimes having seen some dark stuff in bad places, Iraq, Afghanistan, former Yugoslavia, and then I would deliberately try and write some, or find a subject which was comic, just to give me some light relief. And at that time, Boris Johnson wrote colour for the Sunday Telegraph. And I was once sent on a gig which was a kind of Tesco had established a late night kind of love, romance, meeting assignation at midnight. And so you would go with your trolley and hope to bump into Mr. Right or Mrs. Right in the cat food aisle. And then I was sent by an observer to write up this, frankly, fucking nonsense. And when I turned the corner, and then I described to the readers this horrific moment where I saw this thing. It reminded me of an electrocuted polar bear. Readers, it was Boris Johnson. And then there was some kind of gypsy camp that caused enormous outrage in the home counties. And there again, there was terrifying stories of dogs being killed, and people being murdered, and all sorts of bad stuff. And then I turned the corner, and there was Boris Johnson of the Sunday Telegraph. Frankly, the most frightening thing in view. So I know him, and and one other story about him, which is that I went to Brussels once, and following him, he was mayor of London. I was doing a Panorama. And I forgot the actual subject of Panorama, but Boris was going to Brussels, and my producer, who was very, very mean, we went to the Congo together, and also I was doing a story about Glencore, and there's a problem with the Bribery Act, and my producer pal, Andy, made sure that I had no expenses whatsoever in Congo, full stop. No money whatsoever. So he gave me no money, and he said, I'll buy that, I'll buy you a glass of water, I'll buy you one glass of beer, that's all. So that kind of bloke, a good man, but mean. And he worked out that if we took first class Eurostar, which wasn't that much more expensive, we would have a meal, we'd have breakfast on the way out, dinner on the way back, which was cheaper than staying in Brussels and having breakfast, and also more time effective. But we saw Boris get on the train, and then we disappeared. And then we saw Boris at the station of Brussels. And then Boris said to me, "Did you go first class, Sweeney?" And then I went, "Oh." And in the cab, we got in the cab, and before we got to the Brussels High Commission, some kind of Sloaney woman phoned up from the Peterborough column of the Daily Telegraph. "Hello, Mr. Sweeney, from BBC Panorama. Yes, I understand that while the Mayor of London travels second class, you went first class. Is that a good use of BBC money?" So that's what he's like. He's sly. And that was funny, but I think you can't run a country like that, and you can't govern a country, and you can't tell people to sacrifice in the name of the common good while you throw yourself parties. And I know for one that during COVID, we buried my cousin in Liverpool, and I drove up from London to Liverpool and drove back. And we're all Sweeneys, we love a drink, we love a wake, we like to say goodbye to people, and in a proper way. And of course we didn't, because it was against the rules, while he and his pals were partying in Downing Street. I'm a massive Remainer. I believe that the European Union is the future. What I'd very much like to do is for Ukraine to defeat Vladimir Putin's killing machine, for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union. Then I can marry a Ukrainian woman, and then I can get an EU passport. It's a slightly complicated way around,
But is he in trouble?
Yes. So I bet. So, but by the way, there's no one here. No one's listening. Oh, there's the lady who's taping everything. Never mind. I don't know better. My granddaughter, who's 1.5, has bet 100 quid on Boris Johnson not to be Prime Minister this year. Also, I've just bet 67 quid, it wouldn't let me bet any more, on Ben Wallace becoming the next Prime Minister. He's the Defence Secretary, and I'm a Liberal Democrat, and he's a good Tory. I think he's in trouble, but I watched PMQs today, and I felt there's still this kind of King Kong impression from him. And I also look at like the adoring face of Nadine Dorries, who actually I know a bit, and quite like in a different context. But, wow. So I don't know the answer to your question.
Okay. I thought if anybody would, you might.
I want him to go for the good of the country. I want him to stay because the longer he stays, the more likely the Brexit Tories will be crushed for good. So, and I don't understand. My problem is I don't understand the mindset of the people who are supporting him. I don't get it. And therefore I can't read their minds because I just think they're so fucking stupid.
You've described yourself as an old school journalist and a free spirit. How do you think of yourself, or how would you describe an old school journalist?
Can we talk about my hat first? Because the moment we talk about my hat, then I can take it off because it's really hot.
Go ahead.
By the way, the Americans misunderstand Canadians. They're way more dangerous than the Chinese. So what happened was in the early days of the war, it was cold. It was very, very cold, and I'm bald. And I bought this in a ski shop in Italy, in the Dolomites, like 5 years ago. And I actually said to the bloke, "Have you got another? Have you got a black one?" He said, "No, this is the last one we got in the shop." And I kind of looked disgusted, and he said, "I'll sell it to you for €3. So it's a €3 hat. And what happened was I wore it because it was cold and I did films, and then people said it's the guy in the orange hat. And then I discovered that all the bars were closed in Kyiv because of martial law, apart from the Buena Vista. And there's a moment when Max, so a senior police official, I'll put him like that, in Kyiv said, "It's great you're still open, Max, so I can have a drink," said the policeman, who's closing down all the other bars. Anyway, this bar exists, and it's wonderful, and after you've seen some terrible sights, we did the Bucha and Borodanka, it feels grim, and you go and you have a drink and talk to your friends. It's also a kind of intelligence service. And curfew would be in those days like 9 o'clock, and you had to get back to your digs. I've got an Airbnb somewhere on Kremlin. And the police, sometimes in particular, thought the threat was high. The Russians were very close, at one point they were 12 miles away from the centre of the city. That they had the power to shoot to kill, and were after the curfew. So the thing to do is to talk in a very loud English voice, which I can do, and two great phrases. One is Ukrainian, Putin Huyo, which means Putin's a dickhead, and God save the Queen. You do it run together, Putin Huyo, God save the Queen. And I would sort of bark this out through the various checkpoints. And after 2 nights, they would recognise my orange hat, and then all the other journalists would follow me from the bar down the hill to the hotel and where my digs were, and we would get through all the checkpoints with no trouble. Remember on day 2, I was wearing this, and I was arrested by a Ukrainian soldier who said, I've been taking too many pictures, are you a Russian spy? Do I look like a Russian spy? I've got one piece of advice to give you, Perugia, or Trasimeno Music Festival, which is never argue with a man with a loaded machine gun. And he put your hands up, put my hands up, passport, press pass. Anyway, they took me away, put me in this place, and the door closed, and I realised this was trouble. And then a nice old lady gave me a cup of tea, and I thought it was terrible. Anyway, the guy who arrested me They called up the SBU, Ukrainian intelligence, and I had to go to their centre, their headquarters, on day 2 of the war when they were super paranoid. It was genuinely scary, and I was afraid. And then this guy arrested me, Vlad Demchenko, who's now a lieutenant in the Ukrainian army. He looked me up on Google and he said, you've doorstepped Putin? Yes. And then he looked me up some more and he says, you've challenged Donald Trump. Donald Trump's walking out on you and you're still sitting in your chair. Yes. I said, I told you I'm not a Russian spy. And he looked at me and he said, I think you have an interesting story. When he didn't have any followers on Twitter, so I said, it's called Broken Pixel UA, Vlad Demchenko, that's what he is on Twitter. And I said, you've got to say, he had no followers, and I said, everybody should follow this man. This is the guy who arrested me on day 2 of the war. And he's now got 62,000 followers. I took him to the Buena Vista, and we had a drink in Buena Vista, and all the British journalists, my friends, went up to him and shook his hand and said, why the fuck did you let Sweeney go? And he said, it's often that's too hot. I crowdfunded it for charity, for Ukrainian charities. And so if you went on the crowdfund and you bought a ticket for £1 and 5 tickets, and I raised 15,000 quid for Ukrainian charities. And so this, you may find this hard to believe, is the most expensive item of clothing I've ever had. How's your question, Plan?
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. So we're going to talk about Ukraine, as we're talking about Ukraine.
No, we're going to talk about why I'm an old school reporter.
All right.
I don't want to talk about that.
All right. So how do you understand the term old school reporter?
I'm just saying if I can annoy a Canadian enough to get them to get angry.
Very hard to do.
Yeah. They're far more dangerous than the Chinese. I've done that guy. So, I think it's just a kind of... So what was frustrating me towards the fag end of my years at the BBC, in particular when Tony Hall, who I don't like, was the Director General, was there was a sense of crimping and nervousness and neurosis about proper storytelling and about having... When I was at the Observer, Donald Telford, who was in many ways had many flaws, but he said one thing which I like, which is, you buy racehorses, then you let them run. And you want to have freedom as a storyteller to tell your story. And in a sense, if the story bombs, if it's not funny, if it's not good enough, then, and so be it. But I always felt that I had a connection with the public, and the great British public and the wider world beyond, but certainly the British public, because I did take on, fantastic dark bullies like the Church of Scientology, or like Trump, like Vladimir Putin, who I doorstepped in a Mammoth Museum while hungover. The Mammoth Museum is somewhere in Yakutsk, which is somewhere 9 time zones east of London. It's a long, long way away. But I had that connection, and the BBC were kind of, so I just thought, oh, come on, please let me do it. Let me do my thing. And I crashed out of the BBC in an embarrassing way. Never mind, I still pay the licence fee. I still think the BBC is a noble thing. But it's a little bit like the lion in The Wizard of Oz before it finds its courage. It's got a roar, but it's afraid to use it. And so anyway, so the principles are simple, is that you should, it's pointless doing stories about, it's pointless bullying the powerless. We're here, the best of journalism is to give a voice to the voiceless, to help people who are in trouble through no fault of their own, to give them a voice and to stand up to power and money. Not to take money and not to say what power wants you to say. And that's it, it's simple.
So now you're no longer at the BBC, you're on Twitter and you write books and so on. So is this the right place for you?
Well, honestly, I think this hall's too big, if you're asking that question. No, yes, I do. I'm loving it's kind of weird, but the BBC would never have let me spend 2.5 months throughout the whole of the Battle of Kyiv. The BBC would have pulled me out. Most of the other big journalist organisations pulled their people out because of fear. And I take risks, but they're mitigated risks. They're understood risks. And my calculation was simple, and it was a simple piece of the mathematics of war. Ukrainian army is 200,000 strong, but they have an extra 100,000 in militarized police, customs officials, that stuff. That's 300,000 people. So if you attack, you have to have a much higher ratio than the defenders. 3 to 1 is one ratio. I think a better ratio, given the Ukrainian tractor drivers, is 7 to 1. But let's go with 3 to 1. That means that Vladimir Putin, to take Kyiv, needed to attack Ukraine with 900,000, better, 1 million soldiers. If it's 7 to 1, it's 2.1 million. Instead, he attacked with a tenth of that, less than a tenth of 7 to 1. He attacked with 200,000 against 300,000. Those were my sums. And all I had to do was sit in Kyiv with alcohol, waiting for my mathematics to come true. I have to say I got down to my last half bottle of Irish whiskey before I discovered the Buena Vista. And what I told myself was, I'm staying here until my courage or my alcohol runs out. And it got close with the alcohol, I can tell you. There's a moment when I went to the shopping mall at the very beginning of the war, and I knew what was about to happen. And I bought 7, 8 bottles of fancy Italian red, some of it from here, from Umbria, the best wine-producing area on earth, no question. Then I bought some scotch and some gin, some vodka, and when people started looking at my trolley, and I thought it was a bit embarrassing. So I ran off and bought some pasta, and then I thought, I used to get some protein just to make it look good. I never ever cooked the pasta, by the way. I'm still in some Airbnb in Kyiv. And then I bought some tins with fish on it. And it was only when I got home that I realised I bought a massive amount of cat food. But I knew I could sit, and like some of the times there were curfews, it lasted 38 hours. And so I would sit there. At one point I put a big fish in a plastic bag. This big monster fish in a plastic bag. You could see through the plastic bag was see-through. And I put the plastic bag with the fish in it in the frying pan, and then I said to Twitter, okay Twitter, what do I do with this? And somebody replied, you dose it with petrol, and then you throw it in a Russian tank. And what I became, for at least some of it, and I went to Bucha, and I went to Borodanka, and every day I did a diary, Kyiv diary, and I'm writing about this in my book, which is coming out later this month, July 21st, Transworld Books. It's called Killer in the Kremlin. I've written it, and I've done the audio book as well, so you can hear me drone on and tell exactly the same anecdotes as you're hearing now. But there's a sense that I became also, as well as a journalist, as a reporter, but almost like a performance poet in some weird way. Not rhyming, but you know, here's the fish, what do you do with it? You douse it in petrol and throw it in a Russian tank. And there was something lovely, beautiful, awe-inspiring about Ukrainian spirits, about the tractors driving the tanks, towing the tanks. Something about democracy, a democracy smaller, under fire from this monstrous tyranny, and yet holding its own, more than holding its own. And it reminded me of stories I'd read about London, not London, Ontario. Quick dig at Canadians, still it's not rising, it's not working. But about London in 1940, about this thing that everybody just wanted to, make love and go drinking and find beer and go dancing. And every now and then, you had to go and fight Hitler. And everybody knew that. But, are the pubs open? Who's there? And that's what Kyiv felt like. There was a moment when Andrew Pierce who is a right-wing columnist of the Daily Mail, has a radio show on LBC, and was sort of talking about the wonderful Ukrainian spirit just like this. I'm not talking about the gin or the whiskey now, I'm just talking about, anyway, coming. And he said, when are you leaving, John? And I said, Andrew, in London in 2016, I voted Remain, and in Kyiv in 2022, I'm voting Remain. Very good.
It's looking a little grim sometimes for the Ukrainians. Are you still optimistic that they can maintain their sovereignty?
I've done a podcast series called Taking on Putin, which kind of is the source for my book, Killer in the Kremlin. As you can tell from the certainly Killer in the Kremlin is broadly supportive of Vladimir Putin. ... But and for the last podcast, I'm going to write I've got these things called patrons who if you go to my Twitter thing, you can see it. They support me, and I'm going to hope to write a piece tomorrow. I'm certainly going to write it today about metal fatigue, which is I've just driven from London to Perugia in my car with my silly little dog, listening to audiobooks, which is a real treat. 2 days driving, you can't actually take the phone, you can't all you can do is drive and listen to audiobooks. And I listened to John le Carré's Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And there's a bit where Control says to Alec Lemus before they send him back to the East, do you have metal fatigue? You know, this human version of it. And I feel I had it a bit, and I feel my Ukrainian friends have got it as well. The war in the East, a battle of Kyiv, Ukrainians won full stop. The war in the East, the Russians are doing far better. They're using their massive superiority in artillery and manpower as a kind of meat grinder. And the best of Ukraine are getting killed in it. And it's grim. The West at the moment hasn't sent enough heavy metal to even the odds up, and the Ukrainians are utterly committed to what they're doing. But at the moment, the West has been not good enough in terms of getting the right amount of kit there in time. Everybody sends, the Swedes say we're sending this, the Australians the other day, but actually the mass of it isn't enough, and in war, quantity is quality, so they haven't got enough. But we cannot let Vladimir Putin win this war. But what I do in the book, and in the podcast, but in the book certainly, is I set out the evidence that Joe Biden was once asked, do you think Putin's a killer? And Joe Biden said yes. And I think Joe Biden's wrong about that. I do not think Vladimir Putin is a killer. I think he's a serial killer. And I set out the evidence. A lot of BuzzFeed have done some stories about a number of British people who were critics or allies of critics of Vladimir Putin have ended up dead. But I've gone back into Russia, and so, for example, there's a wonderful guy called Professor Norman Dombey, who is the expert witness on behalf of Marina Litvinenko into the inquiry, the eventual public inquiry, far too late, into the poisoning of the husband, Alexander Litvinenko, and Norman Dombey. By the way, I said, do you know anything about this? I said, little. I said, have you got any O-levels in physics? Well, I've got any O-levels, I've got a few. When do you get your degree? I'm just trying to provoke him. And he goes, Oxford. Oh, then give degrees away that place. And then he said, and then I did my doctorate at Caltech. And my supervisor was Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the quark. And then Professor Dombey opened a tin of Spitfire beer and started to drink it, looking at me, and I thought, okay, lost me. He really, really knows his stuff. He identified 3 Russians who he believes with confidence, he can't be completely confident of this, but they were poisoned by polonium-210 before. And they are Robert Sepov, a St. Petersburg gangster, who knew about Vladimir Putin's trading on the black market with the mafia when he was a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. A Chechen warlord who called, I always get his name wrong, it's Ismailov, I believe, Lucha Ismailov. And then a third was a brilliant Russian journalist and MP called Yuri Shevchenko. The story about Yuri Shevchenko is that when he died, his lover went to see him in the morgue. And there was an old lady there who looked like a grandma, and she noted the resemblance in her head. But went up to the guy in charge of the morgue and said, "I can't find Yuri here, it's not him." And he took her and said, "He's over there." And it was the old lady. What happens with polonium-10 is all your hair falls out, your skin starts to flake, your skin starts to fall off. It's an agonizing death. And Putin and Putin's killing machine tried it out on these three Russians before they hit Litvinenko. And remember, it took the best doctors in London, one of the best medical centres in the whole world, 3 whole weeks before they worked it out.
May I change the subject?
Yes.
But Ghislaine Maxwell, you did a 6-part podcast series on this. What interests you in the subject of the person that you take on? Why was Ghislaine Maxwell of interest to you, and you spent so much time and dug so deeply?
I'm actually, just the other day, she got done for 20 years, and my publisher, they were going to put it out in January, they said, "No, how quickly can you knock out the final chapter on sentencing?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually going to the Trasimeno Music Festival, so it's got to be after that." So actually, the moment I stop drinking tonight, I'm going to start doing the final chapter, and that book is called On The Malta. After leaving the BBC, I went to LBC, the company's called Global, and I said I'd love to do some podcasts. And the one we ended up with was doing Ghislaine Maxwell, and I knew something that Netflix had done a big film about Epstein called Filthy Secrets, I think, or Filthy Rich. And Ghislaine was a character in it, but there was no proper understanding of who she was. And I knew from my time in the 80s in Fleet Street, when I was knocking on the door of the Observer, that my colleagues from the Mirror, who I liked and thought were great fun, they had some appalling stories about Robert Maxwell, and I knew those stories. So one of the very first people I got in touch with was Kenny Lennox, this great photographer. He took that wonderful photograph of Mrs. T on the day that she left office, and she's leaning forward in the Jaguar, and Kenny managed to snap her crying, and it's an amazing picture about what happens to power. I can't wait to see if we can pull the same trick off with Boris Johnson sometime later this week, who knows. But he was the man who identified Vladimir Putin. Sorry, Robert Maxwell, I'm blurring things. I'm sorry. He's the man who identified the naked dead body of Robert Maxwell. What they wanted to do, the Spanish authorities wanted to identify him before the widow did, in case there was an awful mistake. And he recognised him, and he told me the story, and he also told me the story of how Ghislaine was broken, and basically they got her to rehearse the speech. But the thing I got, and fascinated me, was that Ghislaine Maxwell was a broken human being, was both a victim and a predator, long before she met Jeffrey Epstein. And I felt there was a story here which I can tell, and actually, in a weird way, it helps explain. It doesn't condone, but it helps explain what she did. Ghislaine Maxwell was psychologically and emotionally and morally abused by her father. She may even have been sexually abused or in some sexualised way, been abused by her father. The evidence isn't. There is some evidence of that. It's very difficult to deal with, but I've tried to deal with it in the best way possible that I can. And so that helps people understand the reason why Ghislaine Maxwell didn't care about these poor girls who were part of Jeffrey Epstein's obscene kind of industrial, like, child factory, was because she didn't understand that something wrong was happening, because I believe that she had been abused herself, certainly psychologically and emotionally. And I go into that, and so I knew I had a story there. And also the simple things that podcasts are useful for. I'm a storyteller, and like when I work for Panorama, you knock everything down to 30 minutes, and so you know what matters is the economy of writing. With a podcast, you can go on and on and on, and I loved it. It's a beautiful medium because you can. Not only can you tell those critical stories, you can tell all the other bits and pieces. You can tell some shaggy dog stories, and then you can go back to the thing you're actually intent upon. And having children was the best thing I've ever done in my life. But the other thing, drinking and making love, but actually telling stories, it's the most beautiful, most human thing. And the best stories are the ones that tell money and power to fuck off. I really believe that. And so suddenly I was kind of gifted this, can you kick this ball into the back of the net? Yes, but please let me. And I've been in trouble. I mean, I was, the Tommy Robinson thing was all a bit depressing. The Panorama didn't put a film out, the BBC didn't put a film out. They hit me with gross.
Tell them Tommy Robinson.
So Tommy Robinson is a far-right British guy, and we tried to do a panorama on him, and it was all a bit messy, and basically what happened was that I didn't focus on him properly. I didn't understand that he was also a bit of a gangster, and he is smart, like all successful gangsters. He's smart and nasty, and there was a woman who had been part of his circle, had fallen out with him. And after she'd fallen out with him, he was still massive on social media. Then he turned on his online hate army onto her, and they threatened her with an acid facial, rape with a barbed wire glove, horrible stuff. And I wined and dined her for the purpose of her giving Panorama an interview. And she had swastika earrings, I later found out. She wasn't wearing them then. So, but she was like Nancy in Oliver Twist, in that she knew Bill Sykes was a bad man, but she was still in love with him. And she secretly filmed me, and I should have been secretly filming her, and we were underprepared and undergunned, or I should have had somebody else with me. And what happened was that he put out a grossly distorted film, but it told the simple truth that I'd been drinking lots with her, because that was the nature of the gig. You can't get these people to talk over wafer biscuits and mineral water in a meeting room. Nazis like good nosh, and they like drinking. And that was, and simply, that's if you think my idea of a fun Friday night is going drinking with somebody who's a bit of a Nazi, I don't, but I was working. But none of my bosses did proper frontline work, and they didn't understand that this thing is by the metal fatigue you get. Anyway, there's a moment when the BBC going to hit me with gross professional misconduct, and they say, have you ever had post-traumatic shock disorder? Yeah, 3 of my friends have been killed. Go see a psychiatrist. And I'm very nervous, and one of the worst days of my life is I sit in the psychiatrist's waiting room. And the psychiatrist looks at me and he says, before we start, Mr. Sweeney, I just want to tell you one thing. I loved your film about the Church of Scientology. And I thought, this is going to be okay. BBC hired a professional psychiatrist. Psychiatrist fucked my psychiatrist report. And the professional psychiatrist said, I thought your film about Scientology was smashing. What do you want me to write? So the BBC did not dismiss me because of professional misconduct. And so but I left and I was sad to leave. And what's nice to the Hunting Glen thing, on the trailer alone, it hit #1 on the UK podcast chart. And I texted my son and I said, my son and my daughter have been worried about me. And I said, Sam, it's #1 on the trailer. And Sam said, texted back, of course it is. I just kind of, So I feel, I'd very much like to thank Tommy Robertson and Tony Hall for wrecking my BBC career, because I've gone on to do something else and I like it, even though this hall's a little too small for my ego.
We're going to take questions in a minute. We can talk for hours, but I want to wrap this up, at least my part of it. I'm wondering whether you are the future of journalism right now.
Oh, do fuck off. I'm a storyteller. And what's sweet is that I've got my patrons. They keep on. At one point during the darkest bit of the war, I had 2,000 patrons. I started with none at all. I went to Ukraine, funded myself. I had not that much money in the bank, and I was going to borrow money if I ran out. But I started a patron gig, and I had 2,000 patrons paying for me. Then there's shots of me, film of me dancing on the table. I tell the first time I danced on the table at Buena Vista was when I heard from a taxi driver who talked to old people in the occupied villages that the Russian soldiers were coming up to the old ladies saying, "We're starving, Grandma, can you give us some food? We're hungry." And that night I went, because I thought the Russians aren't doing as well as everybody thinks they are. By the way, these patrons see pictures of me drinking and dancing on the table, and they send me messages saying, "I'm so pleased my money is being spent on exactly what I intended it to be spent on." And there's just kind of a fantastic moment where I've got these people who've got my back, who understand that if you go and see a man with a hole in his face shot there by the Russian army, that at the end of the day you may well need a drink, and that's perfectly reasonable given what you're doing the rest of the time. And these people are, so what's happened is that social media has enabled me to connect with the great British public and the wider public beyond, in a way which is beautiful. And now, with the money and a bit of luck, I ended up with one helmet and 2 flak jackets, and a driver, and I started pumping money back inside the Ukrainian economy, and it felt beautiful that I was being better able to do my job as a storyteller, telling truth to power, telling the Kremlin to fuck off, get out of this peaceful country. It really does feel like Lord of the Rings. Like Vlad, my pal, the guy who arrested me on the date, I've done the gap. Anyway, he says, we're the Shire. All we want to do is drink beer and go dancing. And then, but there's these orcs, this violence coming at us. He doesn't want to spend his life fighting. He wants to travel the world. The moment the war is over, he's coming here. I'll show him Dempsey's. Boy, if you see the Russian army, you see Dempsey's on a bad night. But I do feel...
What's Dempsey's?
It's a rough wine bar here. It's a bar.
I thought that probably.
Yeah, you've got to go there. It's not rough. But the guy who owns it is from New Jersey, and to be a flavour. But it was beautiful to be given that opportunity. So I don't think I'm the future of journalism, but also at the same time, it's very, very simple. All I want to do is to tell stories that people care about, and the best stories on earth are those that power and money do not want told. And weirdly, suddenly, at the great age of 64, I've got this opportunity to connect directly with the public who are happy for me to, and can pay for me to do the kind of things I want to do. And I feel lucky and blessed.
Lucky and blessed. A good way to perhaps take some questions from the audience. We have a question here, but do we have a microphone? Yeah, we do. And then I'm going to ask, we have another Canadian journalist in the audience who may have some questions. So he will. So yes.
Right. You said you didn't understand Boris's followers when it says, and I don't understand Putin's followers, why they still support him. And I guess part of it is that they are informed by state media. So one question is, do your Twitter feeds and podcasts get into Russia? And more generally, if news is circulated on social media, how do you get to the people who don't already agree with you?
Ooh. So first of all, I forgot to say that I love Russia. I did Russian at school. Я говорю по-русски как испанская корова, я люблю кино. Извини, это шутка не смешная, which means I speak Russian like a Spanish cow. I'm a stupid dwarf, and it's a joke but not a funny one. So I can crack bad jokes in Russian. I'm trying to learn Ukrainian, but my Russian is anyway, it's dreadful. But I love Russia. I first started going to Russia when I was 93, 94, early Yeltsin. And I've got to know some great Russians. Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Esmerova, Boris Nemtsov, shots. Alexei Navalny, I've zoomed him once in 2016, met him in the flesh twice. He's really funny. He's got a slightly weird history in that he supported the far, he went off into the wrong direction, supporting nationalist far-right Russian ideology in 2007, 2008. He's come away from that, but he takes on the Kremlin. He's been poisoned, he's now in jail. So I go into all of this in my book about Putin. At the moment, all the good Russians I know who've taken on Putin, who challenged the killer in the Kremlin, have either been poisoned or shot, or have had to leave, or are in jail. But when I was in Kyiv, President Zelensky of Ukraine had a press conference. He's a great comic actor. He's not quite a comedian, but he's a great comic actor. And everybody around him are kind of, and it's almost crazy. It's not, their venue was, I was almost going to say, I think this venue was even more crazy than their venue, because their venue had a logic. Their venue was a tube station. So where do you give a press conference to 500 journalists, all of whom can betray Zelensky's whereabouts through their mobile phone system? Well, you do it, like Soviet-era tube stations are very deep because they're also nuclear bomb shelters. So this one was like 750 feet below ground. So none of us have got a signal. We're through two halls, so we're down and then along. And Zelensky holds a press conference. And while I was there for the Battle of Kyiv, the Jewish Chronicle got in touch and said, can you strain for us? We're freelance. I said, I'm not Jewish. I said, we don't care. And so I said, as a Jewish Chronicle guy, what's your message, President Zelensky, to the Russian opposition? And he said, I'm grateful to them because words are as powerful as nuclear bombs. So there is another Russia, and I believe in it. It's not popular to say that to my friends in the Ukrainian army, because they're getting metal fatigue, but I continue to say it. And to be fair to them, they understand that because they're a democracy, they've got to put up with people like me, even though it's an unpopular thing to say. I'll carry on saying it. I'm hoping and praying that someday Putin will fall, and when he falls, he'll be replaced by somebody more like Gorbachev or Yeltsin. And what I want to say to the Russian people, if they make that choice, please don't fuck it up again. Because to support the best of Russia is hard, very, very hard right now. As to your second question, it's very, very difficult. Because there's a moment like the Tommy Robinson people, they completely don't read anything I do. What's weird is I've met a Tommy Robinson supporter in the bar in Kyiv who's an ex-British soldier. He said, I like Tommy Robinson, but I quite like you too. And I thought, well, I've got somebody. So we've got to try. We should also police social media more. I'm John Sweeney. Everybody knows who I am. I don't like it that so many people are anonymous. I don't think you should be anonymous on social media. It's a greater problem. Anyway, I guess not too much.
We've got another question back there. John Friesen, eminent editor, journalist from Toronto. John.
Hey, John. Is this on? Am I good? First of all, it's a great pleasure to meet you, even at a distance. I can see you're one hot investigative journalist and have been for a long time, and you're not in any way frightened to burn bridges. I always found in some stories the most difficult things to do sometimes were the small compromises you make to get a story. You're not frightened to be fired by your boss because they don't think you were. But what are the times when you've dodged some ethical issue or something to get at a larger story? I'd be curious if you've ever encountered that. I certainly have, but maybe you're perfect in that.
But why are you wearing your pajamas? Sorry. Sorry, that's a cheap gag. And I apologise. Yeah, so that there is a constant...
Because I gave him the shirt for his birthday.
Okay, I'm going to dig myself a hole in the ground and then I'm going to jump in it. So to answer your question, yes, of course, so for example, when you're undercover, pretending to be somebody else, I went to North Korea and I pretended to be a history professor with an alcohol problem. I thought I carried off that role rather well. The minder from the North Korean secret police, the minder from the North Korean tourist agency, who was of course working for the secret police, looked at me once and they were cooking clams with kerosene. It was disgusting. And then he had a great big glass of the local hooch, the local firewater, the local moonshine, and I knocked it back in one. And I went, oh! And he looked at me and he went, Professor of drinking. But the hardest thing in that gig was keeping the lie up to the woman guide, who actually, in fact, I think also was a very subtle and clever secret police person. But it's it's important for the good of the story and for the greater good of journalism and explaining things to people that sometimes you have to mislead and lie to get access. In the middle of that, you will find somebody who you've still got to lie to, who's good and decent. And that is a problem. And I try and fix things. The other thing, but it's a continuing problem. The other thing is there are times when people don't realise the consequence for them of talking to a journalist. And I think it's very important, in particular, when I was at the BBC, but still, because although I've left and I like swearing, obviously, and I like mucking around, I actually haven't left the BBC values, which are very simple ones for me, which is that you should never say anything critical of someone unless you've got strong evidence, you're confident of your evidence, and you give them an opportunity, as best you can, for them to react, for them to have their own say. And if they won't or can't or don't want to, then you try and reflect what their answer might be, because some of the time what they're doing is gaming you. But nevertheless, that's perfectly fair. I don't think, actually, the thing inside the BBC issue is not impartiality full stop. It's due impartiality, the impartiality that something deserves. So, with the Church of Scientology, I would say it's a lunatic space alien cult, full stop, because it doesn't really deserve much else about it. But inside Scientology, there were people I quite liked. Leah Remini was quite pleasant. In my book on Scientology, Church of Fear, which has actually been translated into Italian, La Chiesa della Paura, I actually signalled I like Leah Remini. one of the two kind of Scientology secret policemen who followed us around, Tommy Davis and the guy shouted at. If you look this up on Twitter, it's very funny. If you look Sweeney and Scientology, sorry, on Google, YouTube, Sweeney and Scientology, the 40-second clip of me going completely bonkers. Shall I do it now, just for fun? Wake you up? You are not there! Sorry, that's too loud. Sorry, I apologise. You were not there for the beginning of the interview. Like this. And then I go, no, will you listen to me? And it's kind of mad, but they've deliberately done that to me to gain me to get to a place where I lost my temper. And then they showed that loss of temper to the world 3 days before our Panorama came out. And John Travolta phoned the Director General of the BBC up 8 times to get me the sack. Each time the then Director General of the BBC, Mark Thompson, he had the thing is whenever he saw me in the corridor, Eric, he would run away. Because he went to the boss of the BBC, he saw me, he would run away, physically run away. But actually Tony Hall kind of mentally ran away, which was far worse than that. But Mark, each and every time Travolta phoned him up, he said, his staff said, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Travolta, he's in a meeting. So this guy, he's always in a meeting? Yes, perpetually. For you. So, anyway, they ran it, and they tried to destroy me completely and utterly for 3 whole days. And it was fascinating just sitting there, as I kind of did in Kyiv, waiting for this storm to blow over, and then you know, you're still there, and I felt embarrassed, and I felt, you know, oh dear, John, it's not your best day, but at the same time, it mattered to get the story out. It mattered to tell people. Back in 2007, Scientology was a monster, and if you're a teenager, a student, they come knocking on your door, run away. So I'm trying to answer so the answer to your question, sir, is that there are times when it's difficult, but at the same time you've got to keep an eye on why you're doing this. And if you betray trust for a cause which is not good enough, or is too pathetic or weak, or not a story, it's why I'm not a royal reporter, then that's not right. But if you're dealing with something like a cult or the government of Russia or the government of North Korea, then I think it's reasonable to tell white lies. I think it is reasonable, but you've got to look at it in the round. One more question? Or 5 more questions? I don't care.
Do we have another question? Yes, here.
John, if we could return to the circumstance of Ukraine. When I think about these kinds of conflicts, I am always alarmed in history and contemporaneously in the complicity of the church. And I wish that you would say something about the Russian Orthodox Church and its metropolitan, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and its metropolitan.
So I don't know enough about the Ukrainian church. All I can tell you is the Russian Orthodox Church that is full of shit. Basically, it has become part of the Kremlin lie factory. So Putin poisons, and Putin's killing machine shoots. The other thing they do is compromise. And I can remember there was an Orthodox priest who was critical of the patriarchy quite a while back, and I was in Russia, and I can remember seeing a Russian tabloid having a sex story of him having sex with somebody he shouldn't be having sex with, and there's just this kind of, it's that kind of thing. So what happened is that Putin is not an ideological communist. What he is a kind of, his ideology is that of the secret police, of what I like to call the Church of Cage ideology. But he's smart enough or human enough, and I don't think he's particularly human, for him to understand that at one level Stalinism, communism was wrong. He gets that. And so what he's done is kind of replaced at least his official ideology with some kind of deep, dark Russian Orthodox ideology, which masks his true ideology, which is the cult of the KGB. By the way, the KGB, according to his book First Person, which is a ghosted autobiography, but it was produced in 2000, and even ghosted autobiographies divulge more about the subject than the subject often imagines, and this was the time of openness, before he'd done his full march, turning Moscow into Pyongyang. But he writes, or his ghost writes, that the KGB he didn't succeed in the KGB, he got a rubbish posting in Dresden. The one thing I read recently, which it's not in my book, and I want it to be in the second edition, is a story about how he ran a neo-Nazi from Dresden in West Germany. He ran some kind of neo-Nazi, somebody who was going to create and sow trouble in the West, and in the West German democracy. And I think, yes, that's exactly him. That's what he does in his first big job, and he's never stopped doing that. But the KGB files said that the reason why we're not going to promote Putin or send him to New York or Bonn or West Berlin is because he completely lacks empathy for others, and he has very poor risk assessment. So at least there were some people in the KGB who knew what they were doing back then. I quite agree. I'd like to meet the guy who wrote that report and shake him by the hand, but I think he's probably dead now. So I don't understand. I'm actually, after this, I'll go away and do some homework. So find me in a bar about 3 o'clock in the morning and I'll give you a good answer to your question. But the problem is that part of the lie machine is to take Russian Orthodoxy and twist its essential message, which is ought to be the Christian message of love thy neighbour, and turn it into kill thy neighbour. And that's wrong and a great abuse of the message of Jesus Christ. And I say that as a super lapsed Catholic.
We had one more question can we take one more? Yeah.
Are you aware of the personality and activities of George Galloway? And what do you think of him?
He's a cunt. Sorry, I swore. I actually, there's video of me saying exactly that. I hate George Galloway with a passion. I first met George Galloway, it's in my book. My first book I wrote, sorry for swearing, that's too much for swear for here, I apologise. I first met George Galloway in 1990, in June, in the Hotel International in Bucharest, where the immediate communist successor to Ceausescu was a guy called Iliescu, and I covered the Romanian Revolution for the Observer. But Iliescu was basically the head figure of what was a coup d'etat, or rather there was a real revolution, and then there was a coup d'etat happened inside that revolution, and they took power. And some of, I like the top 20 richest people in Romania right now, 19 were in the Securitate or connected to the Securitate. George Galloway was paid money to write a soapy whiter than white biography of Iliescu. And I'm a character in this book. And what happens is that in Iliescu, there is a big protest by students and Democrats against the Iliescu government, which is hopelessly and horribly compromised. Because it's the secret police, it's the same communist faces that have been readjusted. And they send the miners, they get the miners out of their pits, give them wooden staves and said, go and hit these people pleading for democracy. And there was a terrifying riot where the state-backed, police-backed miners clubbed and killed 5 people that day. I can remember there was an old man who fell in front of me. He lost his shoe, and this is years ago, but I leapt over him like a gazelle, running for my life. I got to the bar of the Intercontinental, and there's George Galloway. He was still drinking there, smoking a cigar. And I told him that they're trying to kill people. They're trying to kill journalists. They're trying to kill people. And he said, oh, I don't buy the media line. And I just looked at him and I said, fuck you. And that was the first time I fell out with George Galloway. I went to Iraq in 1991. I was so left-wing then, I was against the Western taking back of Kuwait. Part of me was, anyway. And all of the good reporters of the Observer were sent to Kuwait. I was sent to Tehran, which had only just the day before it released the British prisoner, some guy who'd been in MI6 probably, who said rather brilliantly, I went to an English public school. Anyone who's been to an English public school will find a third world prison perfectly agreeable. He was a sweet and funny man. They let him, and the Iranians let him out, and they let us in to see this mudslide of humanity fleeing, the Kurds fleeing Saddam's revenge in 91. And it was the first moment when I saw what Saddam was doing to the Kurds, where I understood that actually Saddam was evil. I was in favour, and I realised I was wrong about this, but I was in favour of the war against Iraq. But what George Galloway did was entirely consistent. Find a dictator and buttress him and support him, and there'd be some money that would change hands. It would be done through a charity, through some kind of mechanism. But he's an ignoble human being. He doesn't like me either. I apologise for swearing.
So, John Sweeney, next time you're here, we'll talk about Bach.
I'm very happy to go back rather than
Johann Sebastian.
I thought you meant Bach. I don't know enough about music. I do like Bach and I do like Brahms, but my favourite is Eric Satie. Not the Gymnopedes, but the other one. Sorry? The Gnossienne. And there is something when I see terrible things and I get home, I like to listen to the Gnossienne. And there is something so beautiful about that music, which reminds me that human beings are put on earth to do better than kill each other. And boy, we've got to improve our game.
John Sweeney, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming.